Well, Harriet Harman is still on her feet responding to Chancellor George Osborne's budget there, and it's a great pleasure to welcome our economics commentator, William Keegan, to give an immediate and spontaneous view to Chancellor Osborne's budget. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
That's in
Nice to
many
be back.
respects an extraordinary one, because there were things like the tax cuts for the middle classes that we were expecting, but I'm not sure anybody was expecting that living wage, for instance, and we'll come to that in a moment. But there was some strange what's been described by Harriet Harman as social engineering in there. It's the idea that child benefits are cut for families that have more than 2 children. Isn't that a bit like China?
I think it's very like China. I think it's quite remarkable. The whole principle of family allowances was to help people with children.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure, I think in the past it wasn't necessarily the first. It got better with subsequent children. And this is a really quite extraordinary statement. It certainly wasn't forecast.
Well, it does mean that he's actually discouraging people from expanding their families, but beyond 2 children. Let's be clear, shall we? Is that what he's doing?
That's what he seems to be doing, and this is, this is prehistory. This is Victorian stuff, or Speenham land,
Just a moment ago, as we were watching it, as very unpleasant and very Victorian.
Yes, yes. I mean, I was expecting, because he's been fairly direct about this, I was expecting tax cuts to be balanced by an assault on the poor, but this is really pushing it, and he has assaulted the poor, there's no doubt.
We sat here in March when he gave his
Yes.
pre-election budget. Do you think this was a budget he'd like to have given ahead of the election?
Oh, definitely. That budget really was a sort of ways and means, just keeping going, because it was heavily inhibited by the Liberals. I suspect a lot of people who didn't vote Liberal at the last election and at the Conservatives in are now they're looking back and saying, pity Nick Clegg isn't still around. And in particular, Danny Alexander, the Chief Secretary, the former Chief Secretary.
So this is a proper Tory budget?
This is a proper Tory budget, and it was interesting to me that Danny Alexander, who was the man meant to control public spending, was actually very publicly warning people what would be ahead if it was a proper Tory budget, and here we are.
So, here we are in a position where tax incentives are being directed at companies and the middle classes, and expenditure is going on things like the armed forces.
Yes, yes.
Do you think that's appealing over the heads of the House of Commons, and indeed over the heads of those that are having their benefits cut, to the wider electorate, in terms of, there's a dog whistle thing in there about defence of the realm, isn't there? What do you make of that?
There is, but although I... Yes, but I mean, I do have some sympathy. I was worried that our defence spending was being cut, apparently, at a time when it shouldn't have been. And after all, before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, I think defence spending was about 5% of GDP. We have a commitment to 2%. The defence chiefs have been up in arms about cuts, and this is definitely a response. What worries me, actually, is that behind all this stuff about national security, they are introducing, but there was no reference in the budget speech, savage cuts in expenditure on the police. And I'm already meeting policemen in the streets who are complaining that crime is going up.
But of course, I suppose they don't want us to know that crime is going
Oh,
on.
no.
It's very emotional stuff to talk about defence of the realm against
That's
the
right.
threat of foreign attacks. Or
Yes.
something. But if they say crime is going up, then that's a big failure for a Tory government.
Well, that's why they just quote earlier statistics which showed that it did fall for a time. But I think we're seeing a change, and that's what the police have been telling me. And I think they're very worried. So the emphasis on national security, and of course with the appalling events in Tunisia recently, clearly that will strike a chord and people will sympathise with that.
Right. We saw Ian Duncan-Smith there, the pensions secretary, shaking his fists like a tennis player at Wimbledon in triumph at the minimum living wage that's going to be introduced nationally. What do you make of that?
Well, that is really stealing the clothes of, there have been a number of think tanks that have been talking about a living wage, and there are some very good economists who specialise in social policy have been talking about this. Of course, the economics textbook response used to be, oh, if you put wages up, then you'll get unemployment because people won't be able to afford so many. And this, for a long time, was the objection to introducing the minimum wage. But it turns out that there are other things going on as well. Nevertheless, he did concede that this would result in higher unemployment, but he argued this would be counterbalanced by more employment elsewhere. Well, we can only wait and see about that.
What about housing, Bill? He's taken action to reduce the tax breaks on buy-to-rent, which were quite controversial.
They were big, but they're still there. I mean, the Treasury spent decades trying to persuade politicians of both persuasions to remove tax incentives to house purchase. And now, of course, there's no mortgage tax relief in general, but there is for this the buy-to-let market. Out of which, and I think the buy-to-let market has been encouraged by the fact that interest rates are so low. So this has been the kind of thing that investment advisors have been telling people to put their money into it. If he had removed the tax relief completely, then that would be devastating. But lowering it to the basic rate, I don't think that's the end of the world for the buy-to-let people.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that insight, and thank you for watching the budget today with IBTimes.co.uk.